We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Welcome to another episode of The Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald. With me today is a very special guest, James Schwartz, a former Arlington Fire Chief and Incident Commander at the Pentagon. Schwartz retired in 2021 after serving 5 years as the Deputy County Manager for Public Safety and Technology in Arlington, Virginia. Prior to that, he served in the Arlington County Fire Department for 32 years, the last 11 as Chief of Department. The Arlington County Fire Department was the lead agency for the response to the September 11, 2001 attack at the Pentagon. Chief Schwartz led the unified command effort for the Pentagon incident. Currently, he is a senior fellow with the program on crisis leadership in the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and teaches in the executive education programs including Leadership in Crisis, the General and Flag Officer Homeland Security Executive Seminar, and Leadership in Homeland Security. He provides frequent lectures on crisis leadership for organizations such as the U.S. State Department, the FBI, several universities, and numerous international audiences. He also lectured as part of the Joint Counterterrorism Awareness Workshop Series on a complex coordinated attack preparedness program by FEMA from 2014 to 2018. He is also a member of the International Association of Fire Chiefs Committee on Terrorism and Homeland Security, which he chaired from 2008 until August of 2014. He previously served on the Advisory Council for the Interagency Threat Assessment and Coordination Group and, subsequently, the Joint Counterterrorism Assessment Team at the National Counterterrorism Center. He also served on the Homeland Security Science and Technology Advisory Committee and was a member of the Advisory Committee for the Department of Homeland Security in 2010. Very pleased to have you here, Mr. Schwartz.
Thanks for the opportunity, Adam. Glad to be here.
Sure. Now, my initial question is, like I said, I've interviewed many people connected to the investigation of the events of September 11th. But you're the first person I've interviewed where you were actually at the crime scene on the day itself. Can you describe for us what the morning hours were like for you before Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon?
Well, so back during that time, my wife and I had a routine. We had 2 young children at the time. They're both grown adults now, but 2 young children, and we had a routine pretty much every weekday, at least when I was in town. I would go to work very early, go to my office at the fire department. She would get the kids off to daycare and school, and then head to work herself. And then in the evening, I would get out, pick up the kids, get dinner together and, be ready for a sort of a family evening. So I'm in my office on the morning of September 11th, and my wife actually calls as she is driving to work. And she says, the news is reporting an airplane into the World Trade Center, has flown into the World Trade Center. I turned on the television in my office and began to absorb the images that many people were waking up to that morning. The North Tower had already been hit. As I looked at those images, based in part because of the investment that we had made in terrorism preparedness, harking all the way back to the early 90s. We had watched the World Trade Center bombing, the first World Trade Center bombing. Oklahoma City bombing in '95. We paid a lot of attention to the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway, also in 1995. So we were already beginning to think about, what terrorism might add to our mission, the kinds of preparations that we would need to make. So when I looked at the North Tower, I immediately thought it was an intentional act. The silhouette of the airplane, a whole silhouette of the airplane on the side of the tower, just spoke to me about a lack of an attempt by the pilot to avoid the building, which if there'd been a mechanical difficulty or just the odds of it having a straight-on strike just didn't make much sense to me. So I started thinking immediately that it was an intentional act. And of course, a short time after beginning to watch, the South Tower was struck, which just confirmed my beliefs. I got on the phone and called our communications center, talked to the ECC administrator and said, I want all of our units that are not assigned to incidents back in quarters. I want them all to return. On a typical day in most fire departments, we are out doing public education demonstrations, we're doing physical fitness, we're doing training, all sorts of activities. And I wanted everybody back in their normal response areas because I was already thinking that with a second airplane, if this was more widespread, the seat of our national government in the DC area certainly would seem like a likely next target.
Right.
And so, the radio call went out. Interestingly, I got a phone call a few minutes later from the Emergency Communications Center, and they asked me, they said, we're getting telephone calls from occupants of high-rise buildings, and they were very specific about one building in particular, which back in 2001, the headquarters of the USA Today newspaper was in Arlington. And their building was right along the Potomac River, along the final flight path of approach for airplanes coming from the north to land at National Airport. People in that building were watching the images on television and began to wonder if they were at risk, if airplanes could fly into their high-rise building. So they called our 911 center and asked the question. The 911 center called me and I said, I don't have anything to offer. There's nothing I can tell them other than if they feel unsafe, leave the building. Interestingly, a few minutes later, a call for an activated fire alarm was dispatched at the USA Today building. We suspected that somebody, when they were told to leave the building, decided to pull the fire alarm to alert other people. And so there was a response that was actually generated, put units in motion going to this activated alarm call. About that same time, Engine 101 was traveling up Interstate 395. This is the roadway that if you traveled all the way to the end, you would hit the 14th Street Bridge, which is what connects Arlington to the District of Columbia. Captain Steve McCoy was in charge of that unit that day, and his engine saw Flight 77 go down. They watched the airplane cross their windshield. They lost it where the horizon, where the plane went down on the other side of the horizon. But Captain McCoy reported an airplane going down in the vicinity of the 14th Street Bridge. The Pentagon is just to the southwest of the 14th Street Bridge. And soon after that, radio calls began coming in. The 911 center started getting calls about, an airplane down, fire, smoke, just all sorts of things that you would expect as our awareness of what was going on began to unfold.
Most of what I'm asking you today will be based off the book Firefight, The Race to Save the Pentagon by Patrick Reed, which you helped to author. Now, okay, you get the call, you arrive at the Pentagon, and when you get there, what struck out at you the most, and what did you want to establish immediately upon arrival?
Well, what struck me most, I mean, there's a gash in the side of the building. Now,
how big was the gash, by the way?
So the gash, I don't have the exact measurements, but it was certainly a large enough gash that it was clear something had penetrated it, and it wasn't something small. In other words, some people initially thought that perhaps it was a small airplane, a small private aircraft. It clearly was much larger than that. And just to set a little bit of context, the Pentagon, which is 5 concentric rings, still today one of the world's largest office buildings, 17.5 miles of hallway in that building. The center court area in the middle of those, of the A ring, the very innermost portion, is 5 acres in size. So this is not an insubstantial building. And because it was built, back during the effort to mobilize for World War II, there's not much steel in the building, not much at all. It's all concrete and limestone. So there's a gash in the building that is quite substantial. There is fire and smoke that is hundreds of feet in the air. On a normal day, there are roughly 25,000 people that work in the building. September 11th was not exactly a normal day by that measure, because the portion where the airplane struck was largely unoccupied. The Pentagon was undergoing its first ever renovation. It was going to be done in stages, and the first stage was proximate to where the airplane went in, and it was all but unoccupied. And so that's what accounts for the relatively low number of casualties, every one of them precious, obviously, to the families who lost loved ones, but 184 people in a building that contained 25,000 was a combination of luck, I would say, where the airplane struck and the fact that it had gone anywhere else, the building would have been much more richly occupied. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people streaming out of the building. It won't surprise people to know that, again, the headquarters of our military, both uniformed and civilian members of the Department of Defense, are doing everything that they can heroically to not only care for the people who've made their way out of the building, but to go back in the building repeatedly to try and do what they can, to help their comrades that might still be stuck in the building. So it's a mass of people. It's a chaotic scene, so to speak. Sure. Scale-wise, obviously extraordinary. But our role typically when we go to the scene of an emergency is to take those elements of chaos and begin to smooth them out by applying our incident management system, by coming up with a strategy to deal with the incident, prioritize where we're going to put our resources. And so that's really what I started to do in those first minutes.
Now, you mentioned that there was a problem of Pentagon personnel entering the scene of impact, make it a very highly dangerous situation for everybody around. Did you establish a perimeter where you wanted to consolidate personnel by ID or in units and whatnot?
So the way that the Incident Command System, ICS, works is that there is one decision maker or set of decision makers, in our case, Unified Command, and what we're essentially doing is breaking the incident down into manageable pieces, and we do that either by geography or by function. So I did establish divisions based on geography, based on areas that I would then assign resources to. But those resources were often a mix of different agencies. We have a very regionalized system in the Washington metropolitan area, where in Northern Virginia, as an example, the jurisdictional boundaries don't mean anything. We share resources based on who's closest to an incident. And so that's a very mature system that had been operating even for decades on September 11, 2001. So we know each other, we know what to expect from each other. We have interoperable communications. And so it's really a matter of, figuring out, again, as I said before, how to prioritize our most important tasks and then apply the available resources to those priorities. No perimeter was established. I did establish a perimeter. In fact, our first logistical request was for 2,000 feet of 6-foot chain link fence, so that we could create a barrier and access points.
Right.
But that took a couple of hours to establish, to get that resource, to get it in place, to get people assigned. The FBI was initially going to create a badging center, but all of their resources got deployed to New York. And so the Secret Service arrived and established a badging operation. Initially, we handed out wristbands, and the wristbands would simply give us a quick visual signal as to who was legitimate and authorized to be, in the work area.
Right. Sure. You mentioned in an interview that I watched about 2 or 3 years ago, where the FBI in 1998 wanted to work with the fire departments and EMS and even attended regional meetings. Can you explain how important this was for September 11, 2001 at the Pentagon?
Yeah. So this was a particular special agent, Chris Combs,
yes,
assigned to the Washington field office. He had studied the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. He'd gotten very close to the the police chief in Oklahoma City, who had that experience. And what Agent Combs came away with from that study, from that deep dive attempt to understand how to manage that kind of an incident, what he came away with was this recognition that the partnership that the Bureau, the FBI, has with local law enforcement, absolutely essential. But when you're dealing with an incident like Oklahoma City or September 11th at the Pentagon, he recognized that the people that the Bureau was first going to be standing next to was the local fire and rescue service. And so in 1998, Chris and his squad began showing up at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Fire Chiefs meeting. We have an organization in the metropolitan area called COG, the Council of Governments. It is all of the local jurisdictions that come together to work on those issues that are not bounded by a jurisdictional line. So think air quality, think economic development, and actually the issue that gave rise to COG in 1957 was the local police chiefs wanted to know how they might work together to provide each other with mutual aid. And over the decades, COG has grown into a very substantial organization. There's a police chiefs committee and about a dozen subcommittees. There's a fire chiefs committee and about a dozen subcommittees that work on technical issues. Chris and his squad started showing up at the fire chiefs meetings and at those technical subcommittee meetings to get acquainted, to share information, to gain a mutual understanding. In fact, on September 8th, 3 days before the attack on the Pentagon, Chris and our respective organizations were at a large-scale field exercise that had been hosted by Fairfax County. The scenario happened to be the release of a chemical agent, but all of the fire and police departments from Northern Virginia, Crises squad from the FBI, all participated in that exercise. And while it was a simulation, the resources, the methods of communications, the information sharing, the unified incident management were all exactly what we did on September 11th. So the ability to know each other, to gain some awareness of who each other are and what they bring to the problem set was just made extraordinarily easier by way of those relationships that had begun, from Chris's, what Chris learned and took away from his study of the Oklahoma City bombing 3 years earlier.
Interestingly enough, this wasn't a question on you bring up projects. In October of 2000, there was a project called the MASCAL, which is the Pentagon Mass Casualty Project. Did that involve anyone from the fire department or local agencies at all?
Yes, so here's the thing, the Pentagon doesn't have its own fire department. It relies on Arlington County. Arlington County Fire Department goes to the Pentagon almost every day. Some of the largest fires before 9/11 that I'd ever been to in my career were at the Pentagon. And so the Pentagon, sort of incorporated us into a lot of their work. Coming out of the study of the sarin attack in Tokyo, the National Capital Region, the Washington metropolitan area, created a specialized team of responders, doctors, and nurses that were specially trained and equipped to deal with incidents involving weapons of mass destruction. And the Pentagon Defense Protective Service, what was the police department back then, participated on that team. So John Jester, who was the chief of the Defense Protective Service, knew us well. So there was a constant working together in exercises, planning efforts, just, a recognition about how important, again, another relationship was.
You mentioned about the fires. Now, when you get there, I mean, the fires were enormous, according to numerous testimonies there, and it spread along the roof line. But it was contained, I think, by mid-afternoon the next day, I want to say, but with smaller pockets of fires yet to be extinguished. And the firemen had to make holes on the vents of the rooftop to try to spread to the other areas of the Pentagon, because if I'm right, I heard that the roof line was made of horsehair, I want to say. Would that be right? How many fire departments were involved in fighting the fire?
That's a good question. I don't have an exact number, in part because we had some unfortunate self-dispatching departments that were not requested but arrived, showed up, engaged anyway. But I think it's safe to say that a combination of what is in the normal regional system that we use resources from, and again, those people who decided to come uninvited, so to speak, I would say that there were close to 24 fire departments.
Yeah, there was a lot.
Yeah.
There was a lot. Yeah. Now, what was the main part? Where was the main location of the biggest fires at the Pentagon?
So when Flight 77 hits the west side of the building, it penetrates the outer three rings.
Right.
So the E ring, the D ring, and the C ring. In fact, on the inner wall, meaning closest to the center court, there is a rather symmetrical hole that is opened up in the C ring wall, where the force of the airplane, the destruction that it is causing, essentially comes to rest. And the jet fuel that is injected into the building creates a fire that is pretty much all 5 floors in the building in that area. We actually do have this diagrammed out in our after action report, and the Pentagon did the same thing. They're in their historical analysis of the event, they mapped out the, through mapping tools exactly what the space was. The fire on the inside of the building was largely under control by the early evening hours of September 11th. And you mentioned the horsehair insulation. This was something that I did not know existed. And it was underneath the slate deck that covered the A-ring, the E-ring, and the corridors that run perpendicular. And the fire got into that area overnight on the 11th, and we went back in the early morning hours to extinguish that fire.
Right. Now, when you get there also, you assigned Arlington Battalion Chief Bob Cornwall to lead the search and rescue operations. Can you describe for us what are the primary functions of a search and rescue at the Pentagon, and who else assisted in this endeavor?
So life safety is the undeniable priority for our work. And oftentimes, other tactics are necessary to enable effective search and rescue. So as an example, sometimes we have to get fire out of the way in order to get in and do search and rescue. But what I was essentially asking Bob to do was I assigned him companies, in other words, groups of firefighters who were obviously trained and equipped. I should back up a little bit and say that Bob, at the time, was a very tenured member of the department. He had spent a good deal of his career in the Crystal City, Pentagon City area. In fact, he'd been the station commander at Station 5, the closest firehouse to the Pentagon. He'd been to the Pentagon more than anybody. On September 11th, Bob was actually back his first day after being off for quite some time to get treatment for cancer. He still didn't have his hair back from his chemotherapy, but he was in it. And so I assigned him companies. I directed him to the area that I wanted him to begin the search and rescue effort. And unfortunately, before that could actually be effectively mounted, we had a report of a second airplane headed our way. And so that initial attempt to do search and rescue got delayed somewhat.
Was the reports of the second plane alluded to Flight 93, or was this another?
No, this was the first report of another airplane, and this was Flight 93.
Right.
This is the FBI headquarters radios to the Washington field office that they, at one point they told us there were 8 aircraft that were unaccounted for.
Yeah.
And that this particular aircraft they believed was headed our way, and that they estimated it to be 20 minutes out. And so we made a determination to evacuate the incident scene, thinking that if it was an airplane, again, as I said earlier, watching the second airplane go into the World Trade Center made clear in my mind that not only were airplanes the tool, the method of attack, but the attack was coming in waves. And so why would a second airplane not be coming to the Pentagon as it had done at the World Trade Center?
You also had to deal with the collapse of the building of the Pentagon as well. And I'm going to assume that your immediate reaction is to shore up whatever parts of the Pentagon that needed to be secured. Who were the primary members involved with that?
So the shoring, it's more a matter of dismantling the collapse pile.
Okay.
In a slightly different kind of search and rescue effort. When I assigned Chief Cornwell and fire companies to begin search and rescue a short time after we arrived on September 11th, that was a kind of search and rescue in which they are going in with protective clothing, with breathing apparatus, and they are searching in the smoke and fire for victims, to be either pulled or to be led out of those circumstances. Once the fire is out and the collapse has occurred, which actually occurred right before, about 15 minutes before the report of the second airline, once the fire is out, we need to start dismantling this pile in the hopes of finding people who might be trapped. So it's a different kind of search and rescue, and it's a very meticulous, only the people who are specially trained in collapse rescue do this kind of work. Arlington County still today has a technical rescue team with members that are specially trained to do this kind of work. They combine with our brothers and sisters in the Alexandria Fire Department, who also have a technical rescue team. And they were the initial responders assigned to begin to dismantle that pile. But I had also on September 11th called for urban search and rescue teams. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has 27 urban search and rescue teams that are dispersed across the country. These are teams also specially trained in technical rescue. The difference is that they are local responders, but they are supported financially by FEMA. Right. So the federal government essentially provides for their resources in return for them being essentially dispatched by FEMA. And so I made a request for urban search and rescue teams. Initially, I wanted 2. And I knew that I would be getting the team from Fairfax County and the team from Montgomery County, Maryland, part of our, in our regional area. And then following that, we got 3 additional teams, one from the Virginia Beach area, one from Memphis, Tennessee, and one from New Mexico.
It was a huge, there was so many people involved. I think at this, from what I've heard, it's the largest investigation in Washington, D.C. history at the Pentagon. Would that be right?
To that point. Yeah. To that point. That may have been eclipsed by more recent events.
During the cleanup phase, you had units working on the Pentagon interior damage debris, and then you had one that was working on plane debris, and these are 2 piles. Where were these areas, and who was in charge of identifying the plane debris?
So debris is evidence. There was lots of evidence to be collected. The FBI, and this goes all the way back to a presidential directive from President Clinton in 1995, I believe, 96 maybe, that designates the FBI as the lead law enforcement agency for all acts of terrorism in the United States. And what that means is that under normal circumstances, it would be local law enforcement who would take the lead in investigating a crime of which collecting evidence is a crucial part. And they, when necessary, would ask for assistance from the FBI. In this case, that is reversed, and the Bureau has the lead responsibilities, although they are incorporating members of the Arlington County Police Department, the Alexandria Police Department, the Fairfax County Police Department into that evidence collection effort, along with other federal law enforcement agencies. And so there were airplane parts, not a lot of them because there's not a lot of the airplane left, but there are pieces of the skin of the airplane that have essentially peeled off as it struck the building and are laying on the west lawn of the Pentagon. the FBI makes an immediate effort to start collecting those up, and they put them in a designated area, again, on the west side, because evidence not only needs to be preserved, its integrity needs to be maintained,
Sure.
meaning the chain of evidence. So that those airplane parts went to a designated area established by the FBI, and then were under 24-hour-a-day guard.
Oh, okay.
So that they could not be tampered with. The airplane parts are obviously evidence, but they're not just evidence for the Bureau at this stage. They are also evidence for the National Transportation Safety Board, who works very closely with the FBI. Their protocols are well known. Each agency's protocols are well known to each other. And so the airplane parts that are initially collected from the ground on the west side are placed in that area. And then subsequent parts of the airplane, which are found as we dismantle that collapsed pile, right? As we take apart that pile, more evidence is revealed. Most of that evidence is the remains of victims, but it is also additional parts of the airplane.
Sure.
And again, all under the protocols of the Bureau for collecting evidence. The rescue technicians would come across evidence. At a certain point, they would call the Bureau's evidence team into where they were working. The Bureau would process the evidence and then take it out of the building to, if it was airplane parts, it was where that designated area was. If it was a different kind of evidence, separate from victim remains, it would go to another area that, again, the FBI controlled. And then if it was human remains, it would go to the temporary morgue that was established on site.
During the book, I learned the person who ran the morgue was Tara Bloch from the FBI, I believe. And also, when they were identifying, this is something new to me, when they were identifying human remains and parts, but they would put color-coded flags. Were you aware of that? Is that right? Or
yes. No, that was the rescue technicians. Again, as they're dismantling, they're not going to stop their work each time they find a discrete piece of evidence.
Sure.
What they do instead is they drop a flag where that evidence is, and then they work. Then they continue to work, and then at a certain point, there's enough for the evidence technicians to do if they come in, because remember, we're still working against the clock here. We're still hopeful to find live victims.
Sure.
And so the idea is to drop a flag where the rescue technician sees the evidence, but then continue to work without disrupting that evidence.
Right.
And then there might be, 2 or 3 dozen flags dropped at a point that the rescue technicians say, okay, well, this is only hindering our work now. Let's get the evidence teams in. They would come in, examine all of those areas, document the evidence, process it, and then the rescue technicians would go back to work.
Another surreal part of your experience there was that, let me be a little bit technical. All right, Flight 77 was holding 11,300 gallons of jet fuel, which equals amount to about approximately 75,000 pounds. You had a number of jet fuel burn victims, and you also had a number of victims in the Pentagon who died without any superficial injuries, but were later described as victims of asphyxiation. Can you describe what happened to these victims and why they died from asphyxiation?
Well, I'm not a medical examiner, obviously,
right.
Medical authority, but what I would tell you is there are 2 things that contributed to those deaths in that way. One is obviously the fire has consumed the oxygen in the area that many of those victims were, and so. We talk about in the profession, we talk about the products of combustion. So there is a lot that is burning that a human being cannot breathe effectively. So their asphyxiation likely came from a combination of those products of combustion and a lack of clean air or oxygen. And then there were also people who expired as a result of the concussive effect of essentially the explosion. When the airplane hits the building, there is a shock wave that goes through, and some of the victims are actually killed by the shock wave.
Interestingly enough, you did mention the Arlington After Action Report, which I'm going to actually link in the description box, and I want people to read that. Now, according to the report, the interior west wing of the Pentagon had a noxious odor of jet fuel. There was fallen electrical lines. You had the corpses of victims. You had smoke and other gases on top of this. You also had a damaged and weakened first floor of the West Wing. This made it not only a structural hazard, but it was also a chemical hazard that many people don't appreciate. Air monitoring and decontamination operations, they began shortly after the arrival of the NMRT task force, which set up like medical tents and corridors. What was it like to work in these conditions?
Well, it was horrific for what we were visually exposed to. I mean, the victims, you know, some were relatively intact, many unfortunately were not. So, you know, that was a stress that we constantly monitored among our responders. Mm. But then there was also, you know, in this area in September, it can still be pretty warm.
Sure.
And so, and on top of that, the fire in the Pentagon, a lot of the heat was still contained within the structure. People had to work in Tyvek or other kinds of protective clothing. So it made for, you know, quite some difficult from a physiological standpoint, the heat conditions that people had to work in. But we recognized very early on that the products of combustion, the jet fuel, who knows what else, by way of exposure, hazardous materials exposure, we needed to protect everybody operating in that area. And so initially, as I stated earlier, people, when we were still fighting fire, were wearing self-contained breathing apparatus. But as the fire was put out and we changed the phase, you know, to more of the urban search and rescue, we still required everybody to wear approved respirators. Mm-hmm. Because as we are finding out most graphically from the number of people in New York that have perished of occupational diseases associated with their working on the pile in New York, that number is soon to eclipse the number of responders that died in the actual collapse in New York. At the Pentagon, thankfully, we've only lost 2 responders, 1 police and 1 fire. The fire loss was actually Battalion Chief Bob Cornwell, that you mentioned earlier. And the FBI has lost, between New York and the Pentagon, I think their number now is 18 agents that worked either the Pentagon or New York and have succumbed as a result of their work. So we were trying to hedge against exposure to what we very clearly understood to be hazardous materials. We have a hazardous materials team. We've dealt with this stuff for these kinds of things for decades. And so the idea of personal protective equipment, including respirators and decontaminating people as they came out of the site and taking off their garments that were exposed, was something that we paid rigorous attention to. Sure. We also did air monitoring. We had a number of agencies with expertise. Arlington County assigned our safety officer, Captain Bob Schwartz, at the time to manage those air collection efforts. and then to analyze the data so that we could regularly understand what the hazards were and whether or not adjustments to PPE, to personal protective equipment, should be made.
Sure. I want to make it clear for the listener who is not familiar with the Pentagon design outlet. Now, the punch-out hole, the exit hole that you mentioned, was located on A&E Drive. And it is said that the items recovered there were even, this is from the book, that human feet were in shoes, parts of the landing gear, some fuselage. And also Patrick Cleed made it clear that when the plane impacted the building, the explosions, as you said earlier, sent shockwaves down the hallways, straight through the ceiling, and exiting the context, making the hole. Now, the plane impact tore through, while it was going through, tore a bank of administrative offices in the E-ring where the Army occupied. Then it destroyed the Navy Command Center, which extended from the D-ring to C-ring, and then to the Defense Intelligence Office on the C-ring, where the debris plowed through the building while this is going through, causing a diagonal field of destruction that tapered like a dagger. Where was this? It is said that the Naval Command Office suffered the most casualties, right? Would that be right?
That is correct. That is correct.
That is correct.
And just, back to our earlier discussion about parts of the airplane, it is just inside that wall at the C ring,
right,
that the landing gear and the black boxes, which are not black, from the airplane were found. So that the landing gear being along with the engines, being among the heaviest articles, associated with an aircraft, with an airframe, those, again, just think of the physics, those, because they've got the most weight, are pushing the furthest into the building. And so it is, some of that landing gear, as well as the black boxes that are discovered right just inside that C-ring wall.
Yeah, that was on the inside, not on the outside of the drive, right? Because when there's pictures showing the hole, as well as this parts of the landing gear on the outside, but what it doesn't show is on the inside of that wall is where a lot of the plane was resting.
Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned, I'm glad you brought this up. You mentioned the black boxes, and I believe they were found on September 14th.
Correct.
And they were found by two individuals. I want to see if I can remember my name. Carlton Berkhammer and Brian Moravitz. I think those are the two people that were found. And Dick Bridges, who was the deputy manager for Arlington, stated that they were found located near, as you say, near the impact point where the majority of the debris was. When this was found, who was in charge of transcribing the data and collecting the black boxes, and what did they manage to transcribe off?
So I don't know all of the people downstream that are associated with the black boxes, but again, because in this case they are primarily evidence, the FBI took possession of them.
Okay.
All right. Now, what we were later informed, we hadn't even left the incident scene yet, but we were told that no information was recoverable from those boxes, in part because of the conditions that they essentially laid in for 3 days. They're built to withstand the crash of an airplane, but they are not if I remember correctly, it is fire and there may be something else that they're not great at withstanding.
Right.
And so what we were informed of, my recollection before we even left the site, was that there was no data to recover from the boxes.
All right. The cockpit voice recorder was destroyed, and the flight data recorder, they actually recovered data from it.
Okay.
That's what I was learned of, and I got that from the National Transportation Safety Board.
That could be, and I've just mixed up the two. Yeah.
No, that's yeah. I want to mention Major General James Jackson, the commanding general for the Military District of Washington, who is actually your conduit from the Department of Defense. What role specifically did Jackson play here, and how important was it to you?
So Jim Jackson, as you said, was the commanding general for the Military District of Washington, of which the Pentagon is not a part. The Pentagon is its own reservation. It is not a part of,
Right.
The Army has responsibilities for managing the building, but it is not part of the Military District of Washington. However, other than, as I was alluding to before, people like John Jester from the Defense Protective Service and Doc Cook, who at the time was the head of the Washington Headquarters Services, which essentially manages the building. Nobody in the Pentagon leadership had any relationship with the local government. They didn't, I think it's safe to say, not pejoratively, but they didn't even really know a lot about how we function. And so they asked General Jackson, because he oversees a number of installations like Fort McNair, Fort Myer, Fort Belvoir, in Fairfax County, just to the south of the metropolitan area. And all of those installations do have relationships with the government, local governments that surround them. In fact, the fire departments of those installations are all part of the automatic and mutual aid system that exists in the Northern Virginia area. So General Jackson had some experience, at least, sitting at the table with locals, maybe not frequently, but, he had some understanding. Because there were so many resources, units, agencies that had showed up, as I said before, some requested, some not, I decided that I needed to convene a meeting to essentially establish and communicate to everybody that was assisting us here how we were managing the incident. So I asked Chief Jester if he could get me a room. This was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 11th. He came back a short time later and told me that he had secured the Secretary of Defense's press briefing room. And I could have it at 6 o'clock. And so at 6 o'clock, we convened what ostensibly were the heads of all of the agencies that were there, assisting. I started out by telling everybody that we had done a really good job for the first 8 hours, but we were going to be there for another 8 days. And I explained to them what the incident command system was and asserted our responsibility as the Arlington County Fire Department to be the lead agency in managing the response. The FBI stood up and said that they were working with the fire department, but would take their direction from us. And at that moment, or at that time, General Jackson also stepped forward, introduced himself, and said he had been assigned by the Secretary to support our response with anything that the Department of Defense had. And what he said to me essentially was, if I have it and you need it, it's yours. He then assigned 2 of his colonels to represent him in unified command, one for the day shift and one for the night shift. And then he and the then fire chief, Ed Plogger, established a partnership that was just enormously beneficial to all of us. And I can't speak highly enough of either Chief Plogger or General Jackson, and the 2 of them together just were masterful in the work that they did.
Such great coordination. I think this is understated in that what I took away from the book was that there was great coordination between the Department of Defense, the FBI, and the local and state fire departments, EMS. I really, because there's so many competing agencies, this is the fear that, especially when I interview former FBI agents who later turned out to be whistleblowers, like Mark Rossini, Ken Williams of Phoenix, where they talk about competing agencies between the CIA and the FBI, the NSA, and the DIA, and there's competing attitude. This wasn't the case at the Pentagon. It was like a free flow. It had to have been quite invaluable.
So I have long attributed that to the fact that going back to the beginning of this story, when we talked about what Chris recognized through his study of Oklahoma City and the way that he built a partnership with us at the local level, again, in an area that the Bureau doesn't traditionally work with. I don't want to gloss over this. On the morning of September 11th, Chris was with all of the heavy rescue squads, most of the heavy rescue squads from the fire departments in the Washington metropolitan area, who had all gathered at the DC Fire Training Academy. And what they were doing there was preparing for the work that they would be called on to do in October, when we were anticipating the International Monetary Fund and World Bank meetings in DC. And if you go back and look, or if you recall, back in those days, those meetings brought with them a lot of protesters, anti-globalists, anarchists, people intent on disrupting, if not tearing down, those institutions. And one of the tactics that those disruptors would use is to lock themselves in devices to block access to public roadways and buildings. And what Chris was doing was sharing with our rescue technicians, who were going to be expected to extricate people from those devices, to open up access to those roadways and buildings. Chris was sharing what he had by way of intelligence. You know, what are those devices? What could we expect when we encountered them? So that understanding about the interdependencies, Chris had the intel, but he didn't have the technical means to do those extrications. And so we had those technical means, but not the intel. So, working together, that recognition that, as I've been saying for 20 years now, when you are dealing with novel events, large scale events that are multidimensional and that we have very little experience with, there isn't a profession or a jurisdiction that has all of the answers, or has all of the resources, or has all of the expertise. It is about coming together and acknowledging that. And we were acknowledging that, again, based on this relationship building with Chris, as well as all of the police and fire departments in the metropolitan area, who again had been working together for decades. Just about a month ago, we had the anniversary of another event here in the Washington area, the 1982 Air Florida crash. A passenger jetliner goes to take off from National Airport. It hasn't been properly de-iced. It actually hits the 14th Street Bridge before crashing into Potomac River. And the response to that incident was a debacle. There was no coordination among jurisdictions. There was some open hostility between jurisdictions. By the way, at the same time that crash occurred, a subway train in an underground tunnel crashed into a wall, killing 4 people. So the metropolitan area, I refer to Air Florida as the bookend event with 9/11. In other words, we didn't shine so well that day in January 1982. But we learned a lot from that. We invested a lot in that. And we recognized, even though we never envisioned something like a commercial airliner into the Pentagon, we recognized that there were going to be points at which we were going to be dependent on each other. We were going to have to support each other. We were going to have to back each other up. And the last thing I'll say about this is that when we established from the first moments that effective working relationship, meaning the fire department and the FBI, and let me not skip over the fact that one of the first people that I met when I arrived at the Pentagon was John Jester, the chief of the
Yeah.
Defense Practice Service. And John has no illusions, no misgivings about what I'm doing there. He knows exactly what I'm going to do. He knows exactly who's going to be in charge of this. Yes, he's in charge of law enforcement at the Pentagon, but this event totally exceeds his expertise and resources. And so he knows right away from that pre-established relationship what he can count on me for. That coming together, that some people will call it a command presence. The fact that we had that in just the first moments, I think sent a powerful signal to everybody that this is how this is going to work. And we are not going to put up with efforts to tear this apart. I'm not going to tell you that there weren't people that had different agendas, right? We had one particular case where a person who works for another federal agency that has little, if anything, to do with emergency response, but he declared at a certain point early in the response that because this was federal land, he was in charge. He was quickly escorted off the scene because he did not have any authority. He did not have an equity in terms of, what we were contending with here. So it wasn't that there weren't some people making small efforts to, I can't even say they could be in the category of tearing it down. It wasn't that there was no friction, because there was here and there, but we coalesced around how we were going to manage this incident in a united way that just gave no space for those efforts. Yeah. We had people coming from elsewhere in the country who did not recognize what we were doing by way of incident command. And they were quickly told, not by me, but by people many levels below me, this is the way it's going. If you don't like it, leave. This is the way this is going to be managed. It's done well for several days now. Get on board or leave. So there was something about the presence, the unified message that I think we conveyed that just tamped down a lot of whatever minuscule efforts, people were trying to, find a foothold with.
By October 2nd, 2001, the search for evidence remains was complete and the site is turned over to the Pentagon. What did you end up doing immediately afterwards?
I started dealing with anthrax.
Oh, is that right?
Anthrax, the mailings to Florida occurred while we were still on the ground at the Pentagon. But we began running white powder calls pretty substantially. And what happened with me was that to catch up on work that obviously had laid unattended to for the time I was at the Pentagon, I was in my office on a Saturday morning when some of my units ran a white powder call at the post office down the street from my office. And I decided, well, let me walk down there and see how they're doing. And I did that. And when I got there, my cell phone rang, and it was the assistant chief of the United States Capitol Police, who I had worked with that specialized team that I mentioned earlier, who supported joint sessions of Congress at the Capitol, like the State of the Union address and those sorts of things. And he said to me, hey, Jim, you might have seen on the news, we have a little bit of a problem going on up here on the Hill. And I said, his name was Jim also. I said, yeah, Jim, I have. And he said, it's a real mess. We are not well organized at all. Will you come over here and set up incident command for us? And so I called my boss, the fire chief, and said, this is what they're asking for. How do you feel about this? And he said, I'm okay with it, just don't get too entangled. And so I spent the next 3 days at the Capitol, essentially putting together their incident command structure and helping them in the early stages of some decision making, before coming back to Arlington and trying to resume some sense of normalcy. For people not, and this is true certainly of New York too, but and I think it's true of many areas of the country, but it's hard to describe for people what those first, I could say weeks and months, but quite frankly, it was a couple of years, were like. Waiting for the next shoe to drop, waiting for, all of these things that we have done to get ready for a monstrous event like September 11th, or for that matter, anthrax. But what's next? And how do we get ready? How do we continue to keep our people operating at a peak level? How do we take care of them and their families who've just been through life-altering events? It was a time of extraordinary work. Just not that we hadn't been doing that prior to 9/11, but it was just, when I think back to that right now, there hasn't been a time in my life when I worked harder or more intensely.
Has the events changed you in any way?
I get asked this question a lot. Personally, as close as I live to the Pentagon, what my wife had to do, she spirited our kids down to Southern Maryland to her parents' house so that they would be safe and so that she could go back to her job as a senior executive at the CIA. There were a lot of pressures, and maintaining an equilibrium was something that I think we both helped each other do in some really difficult circumstances. I think, as importantly, I've spent a lot of years learning from these events so as to be able to share not just the experience, but the lessons, the meaningfulness of what we were able to accomplish. It's unfortunate that we've had many events since then, not all of which, far too many of which have not been able to represent the same level of success that we were able to do at the Pentagon. But, when we first went to the county manager in Arlington and said, look, we're getting all kinds of requests to come tell this story. His reaction was not one of, well, we can't afford to do that. It was not one of, we have work to do here. His reaction, being a professional public manager and a student of public administration, his immediate answer was, this is what we do. This is what we do. We have to give this back. We have to not just tell the story, but share with people what we've been through in a way that will enlighten them, motivate them, hopefully to do the same thing, to make the same investments. The after action report that Ed Plogger walks into the command post on September 13th, and he says, I want to do an after action report. And I looked at him like, are you kidding? I'm a little bit up to my neck in alligators here. And he said, no, if we don't start this now, we're going to lose too much. And he was right. He was right. And so we started, pulling on the threads of data and, started putting stuff together. I've forgotten now, there's over 100, 120, 125 lessons learned in that after action report. And they're broken down by category. And Ron Carley, who was the county manager at the time, when that report was produced, he pulled together his public safety leadership team, the police chief, the fire chief, the emergency manager the emergency management was a program in the fire department. And he said, you have 1 year to address every one of these observations. I want a report in 1 year's time of everything that you've done to address. If it was something you did well, I want to know what you're doing to institutionalize it. If it's something that didn't go so well, I want to know the corrective action. And sure enough, after a year, he required progress reports. But at the end of the year, we submitted to him a report that stated, this is what we've done to address every one of these issues. And, lots of after action reports get thrown up on a shelf and forgotten. Lessons learned are only those that are later applied. And that's what Ron was trying to, impress upon us, that the system needs to function, the institutions need to function, and these things need to be incorporated into the way that you do your business.
Probably one of the final questions I have, I probably wanted to, it's unfortunate I have to ask this, but it's imperative. One of the many fringe conspiracy theories we've come across over the years is the fact that little evidence of airline debris was found at the Pentagon, such as why there were no large engines found, no whole bodies from the planes, no people in the planes that were found, or no wings. What would you say to these people who make the statement that if there was a plane crash at the Pentagon, why there was no large piece of the plane recovered or whole bodies of the people on board the plane?
Well, first I will tell you that in one experience that still sears in my mind, there was all but a whole body found of one occupant of the airplane. And I won't go into any details out of respect for her and her family. As to the larger issue about the airplane, one, we do have video evidence of the airplane as it approaches the building and strikes the building. We have plenty of witnesses like myself who saw the pieces of the airplane, including some fairly large pieces, substantial, if not whole engines, certainly most of engines. So, for whatever it's worth, eyewitnesses to that history, we've recorded it. We have, our experiences to share. We were on the ground. We've seen those. In many instances, we touched those artifacts. I think I would also just ask those who still have questions, or more specifically, those arguing a different scenario. you really dishonor the loss of those 184 people and their families who have had to bear the weight of those losses for 20 years now and will for, long into the future. It was a tragic event that certainly represented the failure of government, our failure to protect the populace. But that's where it ends. That's where it ends. It's not anything nefarious about the attack on the Pentagon was in the actions of those 5 hijackers that took that airplane into the building. Obviously part of the 19 that did all 4 planes, but the 5 that commandeered American Airlines Flight 77 and flew it into the airline, that was the only evil that occurred that day. The rest was 184 innocent lives lost, when they got on an airplane to go do something important in their lives.
Arlington County Fire Chief and Incident Commander at the Pentagon, James Schwartz, thank you very much for coming on today.